Until the last Ukrainian. Ukraine and the European Union reject the peace plan proposed by US President Donald Trump. Despite Ukraine's desperate situation, the Ukrainian government will make no concessions of any kind and will persevere in its fight against Russia until total destruction. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin the 296th live broadcast of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us. And please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, and PayPal. Joining us from Madrid, Spain, on the other side of the European continent, is Mr. Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, how are things over there?
Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Muy buenas, pues un placer estar aquí.
Very good. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with fresh news that goes in the direction of what we've already discussed in previous programs. I think the trends we predicted are coming true, so we can congratulate ourselves in that regard. And by the way, we can calmly say that little of all this, what we talk about here or what you hear on other alternative channels, you'll see in the corporate media, because the time has come to see how they're going to explain the defeat and the disaster.
This is the big news of the day, dear Juan Antonio. In The Independent, a decidedly anti-Russian outlet, the headline reads, Zelensky's chief of staff resigns after raids in corruption probe. Andriy Yermak, the Ukrainian president's right-hand man, says he is fully cooperating as the investigation continues. And shortly after this news, this major news, an even bigger one followed. Yermak leaves the government. Yermak has resigned. Zelensky's right-hand man has left the government. And from now on, what next? The big question.
Well, look, you started the program with some words that were precisely from Yermak. Well, those words were already the final trigger, of course. Yermak was doomed. Yermak wasn't just Zelensky's right-hand man. He was the power behind the scenes. He was the one who really pulled the strings and directed the structures of the Kiev regime. He was a key figure. When the massive corruption scandals began to come to light, it was no surprise, because all of us who had a more objective view of the whole issue of Ukraine knew perfectly well what the essence of that regime was. Corruption, which didn't start with the beginning of the Russian military operation, but long before. Not even with Maidan, but long before that. It goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a clique of oligarchs seized public property, the property of the state, enriched themselves by robbing the people, as is the norm, and entrenched themselves there, dominating Ukrainian politics ever since. If at some point we have to set an actual date for when the Ukrainian tragedy began, it has to be in 1990, with that so-called independence, in quotes, that was forged in a village in Belarus among the presidents of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, to dissolve the Soviet Union behind the backs of the Soviet people and against the referendum that had been held. That's where the tragedy begins. Some NAFO idiot might say it was the Russian aggression of 22. That nonsense, because that kind of stupidity has led to Ukraine being destroyed right now. That's the reality. To put things in context, first, as we've already said, Yermak wasn't simply Zelensky's right-hand man, some kind of vice president or plenipotentiary deputy to Zelensky. He was much more. He was the head, the ideologue, the strategist behind all the operations carried out by that regime. And therefore he was part of the caste, the clique that has dominated Ukrainian politics, and part of the network that has grown rich through corruption. and corruption from the very beginning. It's not as if now, or as we once mentioned, like in the movie Casablanca, when the owner of Rick's Cafe says, "What a scandal, gambling is going on here," as if he didn't know it was his bar, his cafe. Well, it's the same here. What a scandal, there's corruption in Ukraine. The real scandal is that you've been hiding it for 3.5 years to justify supporting a criminal regime. That's the scandal. Let's see if Felipe VI, King of Spain, finds out. If he realizes who he's welcoming to the palace. A criminal, a corrupt man, a thief. Let's see if he finds out. And along with Felipe VI, the rest of the Spanish citizens, and by extension the European citizens. Now, someone might ask, okay, but if it's always been like this, why now? Why now? Well, then we have to start from 2 points to understand what's happening.
Hay que partir de dos cuestiones para entender lo que está pasando. Uno, como ya se lo expresó.
First, as has already been publicly stated many times and was made clear at the Alaska meeting, President Putin has always insisted that a peace treaty with Ukraine cannot be signed by Zelensky. Why? Because he is an illegitimate president. Illegitimate since March 2025 when his term ended. He should have called elections and has not done so, using martial law due to the war as an excuse. But I especially encourage NAFOS, Junta Letras, and other media manipulators to take a look at the Ukrainian constitution and see in which article it says that the existence of martial law allows the government to remain in an interim state indefinitely. Until that martial law. That's uncertain, that's false, that's a lie. On the other hand, if such a situation were to occur, the one who would have legitimacy would be the president of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. Lavrov already said it in a press conference. That is, we would have to deal with the president of the Rada, who is the legitimate one. And why is this issue of legitimacy important? Because no one is going to sign a peace agreement that must go through international institutions to become part of international law with a president who is illegitimate. Because the next one, who comes along, quite rightly, will say, I'm not going to respect that agreement. I'm not going to respect that treaty. Why? Because it was signed by a president who is illegitimate. It's just that simple, that logical, that obvious, it's that straightforward. So while Russia wasn't going to negotiate with Zelensky, fine, who is the other belligerent actor in that war? The Zelensky regime and its puppet government, which depends entirely on Brussels, London, and Washington? No. Who has really sustained this war? NATO. Who runs NATO? The United States. Therefore, the other, let's say, belligerent party that has the power to decide and reach a treaty, a peace agreement, is the United States. And of course, Trump finds himself in a situation where he can't reach a peace treaty because Russia isn't going to negotiate a treaty that has to be signed by someone who is illegitimate. Consequently, Trump sees that he has to fulfill a campaign promise to end the conflict in Ukraine, or at least the involvement of the United States in that conflict. In addition, Trump needs the agreement because he wants to establish a series of relations with Russia that are economically beneficial to the United States, because it needs them, and also because he wants to exploit what was already signed with the Ukrainian regime regarding its wealth in that pact, in that agreement that Zelensky also signed, practically handing over all the wealth and infrastructure to the United States to exploit, I don't know, for generations. And Trump also needs to stop the war, because the war is taking a very bad turn for the United States, for NATO, for Europe, and for Ukraine. The Russians are advancing along the entire front. The Ukrainians themselves are saying it. There's a member of parliament who said just today that of course the front is retreating every day, by an average of 5 kilometers. 5 kilometers along a front of over 1,000, well, this is starting to look really bad. Really bad. In the southern area, for example, they're advancing over defense lines that are empty, with no troops. Kupiansk has fallen, Pokrovsk has fallen, they're surrounded in Minograd, they've entered Ulay-Lupil, they've entered Seversk, they've entered Konstantinovka, and they're 15 kilometers from Slavyansk.
Están a 15 kilómetros de Slavyansk. Es decir, la situación no puede ser más desastrosa.
In other words, the situation couldn't be more disastrous. Consequently, Trump wants to avoid a disaster at all costs. He wants to prevent the front from collapsing, the army from falling apart, and the Russians from advancing unchecked as far as they want. And of course, the press can say whatever it wants, but that ultimately falls on Trump. Later, he'll be called out in the United States. They'll say that not only did he fail to stop the war, but that the entire NATO, led by the US, was unable to stop the Russians. That's very dangerous, and we must also remember that in 10 months there will be crucial midterm elections in the United States. So there's a growing sense of urgency. That said, what does Trump do? He makes a move. And he says, okay, first of all, get rid of Zelensky. The first warning is given through investigations by Ukraine's anti-corruption office, NABU, which is run by the US Embassy, as we've mentioned before, and therefore depends on the instructions coming from Washington. NABU starts investigating, starts digging around. What does Zelensky's regime do? It tries to ban it, tries to shut it down. The US Embassy makes a move, sends people into the streets. There are protests, massive protests, showing the Ukrainian population's own discontent with the situation. Zelensky backs down, Yermak backs down, they have no other choice. What happens with NABU? NABU keeps going. The whole summer passes, September passes, and everything seems calm. But then this moment comes, this critical point, this turning point we've talked about. What does Trump do? He orders corruption scandals to start coming out.
And
the corruption network isn't a case within the system, it is the system itself, because it reaches the entire regime, the entire regime. The news keeps becoming almost outdated as we speak. That is, it started with a personal friend, business partner, and also advisor to Zelensky, Timur Mindich, over a case involving commissions on invoices and energy contracts with Energoatom, which handles energy matters in Ukraine. From there, it began to implicate the Minister of Energy, who resigned, the Minister of Agriculture, who also resigned, the former Minister of Defense, Umarov, and high-ranking officials, some arrested, others on the run. By the way, all of them fled to a Middle Eastern country, quite well known for its own affairs.
To Iran, Juan Antonio, not to Iran, right?
No, it's not Iran. I mean, it's the country of the star. The country of the star. So, well, in all of that, an FBI investigation appears regarding Sensei Bank, because packages of dollars still wrapped show up, coming from the Federal Reserve in Atlanta or Kansas, and from there an investigation begins. It's a trail that also leads to another Ukrainian oligarch who has always been in Russia and does business there, like Friedman. But that's not where it ends, not at all. I mean, there's another company that shows up, already connected to Umarov, called Firepoint, which is now dedicated to drones, but in which Zelensky is directly involved. This one was going to manufacture the famous Flamingo missiles, a scam. Also related to Bakhtar 95, which is a production company Zelensky is involved in behind the whole show, and which now also deals with drones. Of course, all of this was connected, and that's what the famous oligarch who promoted Zelensky, Igor Kolomoisky, has admitted, also from the same tribe of the Star Flag, like all of them. And one says, well, what a network. The network is of such magnitude that the NABU report itself describes it as a high-level criminal organization. So when we talk here about that whole clique being a gang of criminals received by the King of Spain, we're echoing the judgment of the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Office. That's the picture. But it doesn't end there. I had more information.
Pero tampoco queda ahí, ¿eh? Yo tenía, es decir, más datos, es decir, por ejemplo, la de una base naval que han vendido los...
For example, that of a naval base whose land was sold for a much lower amount than its actual value, in which these same people are also involved. Or, and here the American hand is directly at play, the disappearance of $48 billion. $48 billion from the international aid sent to Ukraine. Funds that have started to slip away, be laundered, and cleaned through European channels. Among others, Estonia, where the current European Union Foreign Minister, Kaja Kallas, is from. And of course all this leads us to think that the network reaches Brussels and possibly beyond. Because I don't think Zelensky and his 4 friends kept 48 billion euros for themselves. It's too much money, and besides too obvious, because it would be very easy to uncover.
Vamos, sería muy fácil de descubrir, es mucho dinero, es demasiado dinero.
It's a lot of money. It's too much money. There must be complicity, high-level complicity within the European political class itself that has been supporting that regime. No audits are being done. In Ukraine, no audits have been carried out since the military operation began. Everything that had happened there, when Trump said that 100 billion had disappeared, we'll see if he wasn't right, which would be the height of absurdity. We'll see if he wasn't right that indeed $100 billion vanished. No one knows where. Because seeing what's coming out. And then, of course, since the right-hand man, the one who somehow dominates, controls, and manages the situation, was Jermak, that is, that high-level criminal organization, he was given a sort of ultimatum until Thanksgiving to resign.
Para que dimitiera. Él no solamente no dimite, imagino que siguiendo...
Not only does he refuse to resign, I imagine following the directives of his cronies in Brussels and London, but he also dares to tear down Trump's peace plan, which made it obvious that the day after Thanksgiving, the United States would make a move. And they already have. They've searched the offices and forced Yermak to step down, simply through the formality of a resignation letter. It's really a dismissal, because he had no intention whatsoever of leaving power, leaving Zelensky alone and isolated. In other words, we've reached the final stage. Once this machinery is set in motion, it won't stop unless Trump wants it to and tells New, stop investigating. That's when Trump presents that 28-point peace plan proposal.
Esa propuesta de plan de paz de 28 puntos, que es
Zelensky, along with his friends, his European buddies, is trying to block, trying to change things. The Europeans said it's unacceptable, that this is a strategic defeat for NATO. They're right about that. It is a strategic defeat for NATO. Moreover, depending on how all this ends, it's quite possible that NATO now has an expiration date. A very dark future. And well, this is the situation as of today. This is what we've seen today. What will we see tomorrow? Well, that depends on what Zelensky decides to do. Everything suggests that Zelensky will have no other choice. After Trump's warning, with his earlier words about, you'll find a place to live, meaning you'll have to leave Ukraine, you'll have to go, and somewhere find a place to live, where you can be with your children, your wife, your parents. Do you know where his parents are living? Where do Zelensky's parents live? In the country with the star on its flag?
No, but he would have answered correctly.
So Fran knows perfectly well how the game is already being played. Zelensky must know it too. Zelensky, I don't know if he really didn't think things would get this far, because you'd have to be a bit stubborn. Or maybe they're all already so... It's like a wheel of killers. Either we all go down together and... I don't know. But it feels like that's where they are. Because otherwise, well, he should have realized that the messages were crystal clear. I mean, the NABU's anti-corruption action is tied to Trump's 28-point peace proposal, which has its issues, but it's true that it gives Russia practically most of the conditions it demanded to reach a peace treaty. Of course, it's just a proposal. it still has to be negotiated with the Kremlin.
Es una propuesta. Todavía queda por negociarla con el Kremlin. De hecho, creo que Van Wyckoff y...
In fact, I think Van Wyckoff and Jared Kastner are going to Russia to deal with the document officially to deliver the proposal. Because let's keep one thing in mind. What we've learned about the 28-point proposal is what has been leaked to the press. We haven't seen the official document. It was leaked, moreover, by a pernicious element, a traitor named Kellogg, General Kellogg. That is to say, a neocon, but not just a neocon. He must also be involved in the Ukrainian corruption scheme, because his daughter has business there. Interestingly, and this also takes us back to the matter of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, who was also a member of the board of directors of Burisma, Ukraine's main gas company.
La administración de Burisma, la principal empresa gasística de Ucrania. O sea, esto ha sido todo el gigantesco expolio.
I mean, this has all been the gigantic plundering of a country that, well, is being thrown against Russia because they needed to seek a strategic defeat for Russia. And on top of that, we polished them off and robbed them blind. And meanwhile, we have to put up with this fool, the green louse from Kiev, coming here to see the Guernica painting and being received by that other guy at the Zarzuela Palace. And on top of it all, walking away with almost €1 billion taken from Spaniards' pockets. It's unbelievable. It's outrageous that this thief, along with his clique, comes to Spain, gets received almost like a hero of democracy, and then walks away with $1 billion from our pockets.
Y encima se lleven 1.000 millones de nuestros bolsillos. Y esto es lo que estamos viendo. ¿Qué pasa? Pues,
and this is what we're seeing. What's happening? Well, what you, dear Spanish citizens, and also the rest of Europe are going to see on television, what you'll read in the press, is being cooked up right now. Because, of course, they have to start saying something. Because if they tell you things the way I'm telling you, or the way Ezequiel, or Coronel Baños, or Limpierez, or anyone else might tell you, if you only listen to them and they don't give you another narrative, then you're going to get angry, and rightly so. That has to be avoided. Of course, what are we going to say when the president of the Spanish government receives him at Moncloa? Dear Vladimir, dear friend. Good thing I'm not saying he said pro-accomplice, right?
Menos mal que no digo que dijo pro-cómplice, ¿no? Pues ya sería el colmo.
Well, that would really be the last straw. Anyway, very unfortunate. Very unfortunate, because none of this was unknown to us. We've never stopped talking about it. We can go back to past shows on this and other channels. We've talked about Mrs. Zelensky's spending at the most expensive stores in New York, right? Or about the purchase of properties. We've talked about that. Or that Zelensky already appeared in the Panama Papers back in the day. So what's going on? Now, as I said, at the White House, right? What a scandal. What's being stolen? Very well. Investigative journalists, the press, La Sexta. So it turns out they were all hoaxes from the Kremlin's influence agents.
Eran todos bulos de los agentes de influencia del Kremlin.
Sí, ahora Juan Antonio, como establece ese...
Yes, now, Juan Antonio Aguilar, as that Rio Platense Spanish saying goes, the pig isn't to blame, but the one who feeds it. Exactly. A shameless man, a brazen one, a cynic. But behind Zelensky, many hands.
Pero detrás de Zelensky,
Claro,
manos,
Zelensky
¿no?
era un monigote al que pagaban.
Zelensky was a puppet who was being paid. That is, the fact that he could develop a network of corruption was simply the payment for carrying out the job he was doing. If it hadn't been that way, when Boris Johnson showed up in Kiev to tell him, don't sign the agreement you've reached with the Russians and keep the war going, well, Zelensky would have said at least, I'll consult with my ministers, with the Rada, I don't know, something. But no, Zelensky did what he was ordered to do. Did he get rich from it? Yes, that was the payment. But he did what he was ordered to do. Therefore, the ultimate responsibility, no matter how bad or corrupt Zelensky may have been, lies with those who for 3 years, more than 3 years, have been supporting, paying, financing, training, organizing, arming, and directing a puppet government run from abroad in Kiev.
Manejado desde el extranjero en Kiev. Y cuando ya llega el momento del desastre,
And when the moment of disaster finally arrives, when the end of the cycle in which the Ukrainian army went from victory to victory is being fulfilled and we reach the final defeat, then it appears, now he has to be eliminated. He has to be removed from the scene. Now we bring out his corruption. We'll see where we can cut it off, because if the Europeans get too stubborn, maybe some corrupt network in Europe connected to the Ukrainian networks will also come to light. I'll leave it at that. Maybe someone will end up getting splashed. So, well, we're in... The other day, I think we were talking about the beginning and the end. I think we're already starting to see the end. The Zelensky regime can't have much time left. Why? Because if this weekend they go to Moscow to deliver the proposal that the Kremlin has to study, the Kremlin will take some time to analyze it, to review it, and a negotiation will have to begin. Putin has already said it. He only negotiates with the United States because that's the other belligerent side. That's the logic. And the one who can make decisions is only going to negotiate with the United States. Therefore, they're going to go point by point through that agreement, that peace plan. It could take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or 3 months. And in the meantime, the Zelensky regime is going to fall. It has to fall, because no matter how much progress is made in the negotiations, in the end, the one who has to sign the capitulation, because Trump isn't going to sign it, the capitulation will be signed by whoever is in Kiev. And it can't be Zelensky because the Russians won't accept him. So that's the end. We're already at the end.
How long it will last, I don't know, but it's already reached that point. Recent statements, just a little while ago, from Zelensky regarding this issue. Here are his words. We are preparing for a meeting with the US side to discuss the necessary steps to ensure that there is peace and that it is a decent peace. And when all attention is focused on diplomacy, internal strength is needed to defend ourselves in the war. Internal strength is the foundation of our external unity and of our relationship with the world. And to have internal strength, there must be no reason to be distracted by anything other than the defense of Ukraine. I don't want anyone to have questions about Ukraine. That's why we are. Today, the following internal decisions were made. First, the office of the President of Ukraine will be restarted.
Reiniciará la oficina del presidente de Ucrania. El jefe de la oficina, Andriy Yermak.
The head of the office, Andriy Yermak, has resigned. I thank Andriy for always representing the Ukrainian position in negotiations, as it should be. It has always been a patriotic stance, but I want there to be no rumors or speculation. As for the new head of the office, tomorrow I will hold consultations with those who can lead this institution. We will soon have negotiations, and our representatives will be present. They will include the Chief of the General Staff, the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Secretary of the National Defense Council, and our intelligence. And when we all face the external challenge of war, we must be strong internally. 100% of our strength will be focused on the defense of Ukraine.
Bueno, vamos a ver. Es una llamada a cerrar filas. Ya sabe claramente.
Reset, a reset. The reset, the reset. Well, let's see. It's a call to close ranks. He's now clearly aware of how serious the situation is. So it's a call for other actors within Ukraine not to be thinking right now, let's put an end to this situation. For example, a majority led by Poroshenko, Timoshenko, or others. Or, for instance, a group of high-ranking military officers deciding this is as far as we go or something like that. It's been a call to close ranks. I don't know what he called it. Something from the presidential office, reconfiguration or something like that, right? I mean, he has to rebuild it with a new person and hold consultations. I'll tell you what his first consultation will be. With Washington. He's going to ask them, who should I appoint? Who do you want me to appoint? And that's how it will go. If he wants to take the less bad path, if he wants to take the worse one, he can call London or Brussels and say, who do you want me to appoint? And then things get worse. It's very unfortunate to have to hear this from a guy who once said in a TV interview that Yermak would leave when he did. He'll leave with me, he said exactly. Yermak will be here and will leave with me. Maybe he'll even keep his word. That is, him leaving a day after me doesn't change anything. But, of course, I don't know. Maybe even Zelensky at this point is thinking that the best thing would be to leave. The thing is, they're not going to let him. Now he has to follow the orders he's given to have everything ready before he has to leave the presidency, and a step is taken forward on the issue of peace negotiations. Or keep obeying Brussels, thinking the Europeans will save him from everything. And then the next Naboo investigation might be the one that ends up searching his office. Maybe at some point someone gets arrested. Or maybe indeed someone refuses to close ranks and we find ourselves facing an internal palace coup, or a coup from the stands, or a military coup, which wouldn't be a good thing. Because the internal situation in Ukraine is already complicated enough that it could even lead to clashes and turn into a possible civil war. Right now, the steps that need to be taken are very delicate, because the situation could become very dangerous.
Here are some of the repercussions of this on Reuters. Zelensky's trusted aide resigns amid corruption probe in Ukraine. That's one of them. Today I'm reminded of many sayings. Another very nice Spanish saying, the one that goes, "You can't cover the sun with your hand." Well, right now Juan Antonio, even Western media, faced with the scale of corruption and the military collapse in Ukraine, are beginning to present a perspective very similar to ours, Juan Antonio. Of course, we've been presenting it for 3 or 4 years now.
Before 1 million people died. Yes, of course.
Exactly. Here, for example, The Guardian, the search or raid on Yermak's properties will have enormous repercussions for Ukraine and potentially for the peace talks. Immediate reaction. The revelations that the anti-corruption police are searching the property of Volodymyr Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, will have major repercussions for the Ukrainian political scene and possibly also for the peace negotiations. Basically, the same analysis as Juan Antonio's, but now from The Guardian, couldn't be more anti-Russian. Here, on the other hand, is a man named Christoph Wanner, the correspondent for the German newspaper Die Welt, part of the Axel Springer Group, which owns Bild, the most important media group in Germany. Pay attention to the following analysis and to what this man says about the reasons for the raid on Yermak's property. Mr. Andriy Yermak staged a rebellion yesterday against the US president when he told The Atlantic, "We will not concede any territory of Ukraine. Constitutionally, we will not grant any territory to Russia."
That's what Yermak said yesterday to The Atlantic.
And now some fellow American reporters here in Moscow are telling me that the Americans sent the Naboo to Yermak. This is the current situation in Ukraine, according to them.
It's laughable. It really is. I mean, to call the director of Bild, come on, you already know, don't you? You already know. What eagles are those? No, now they have to say it. They can't hide, obviously, what's happening, because at this point, the only thing they can do is silence it. Stick to the most superficial aspects. Oh, well, it's a corruption case. He had another gold-plated bathroom like the other one, right? That is, the superficial aspects. And they'll have to come up with a narrative to justify themselves. Because, of course, it's been 3.5 years of lies. 3.5 years deceiving people, deceiving the public.
3 años y medio engañando a la gente, engañando a la ciudadanía. 3 años y medio sacándole el dinero a la gente.
3.5 years, taking people's money to send it to this clique, this high-level criminal organization, according to Now herself. Let's see how they justify it now. They'll have to come up with a narrative, obviously. Let's be clear. Yermak couldn't have just said on his own, well, now I'm going to say we won't follow Trump's peace plan, and Zelensky knew nothing about it. In that rebellion, Zelensky knew nothing. Of course he did. That's the position. Because that's Brussels' position, Europe's position, the position of Meloni, Merz, Macron, Sanchez, and Starmer. That's the position.
Sánchez, de Starmer. Esa es la posición. ¿Cómo decir? Y por tanto,
How to put it. And so German, what did he do? He made public the position of those who are protecting him, those who are supporting him in this situation. In other words, let no one be deceived. Let's not now, as the saying goes, start throwing spears after falling off the horse. When the rider falls off the horse, now we start throwing spears at him. Come on, no. But let's see, we need to dig into the archives. We have to show again, for example, images of Zelensky in the Spanish parliament or in the British parliament or in the French parliament. We need to show them again so that people remember the disgrace.
Hay que volver a ponerlas para que la gente recuerde la ignominia. Es decir, hace falta hacerlo. O todos lo recordamos.
That is to say, it needs to be done, or we all remember it, and now we find out, right? They can't cover it up. Obviously, they can't cover it up. And well, logically, it has to be said Trump is winning the game because he has much more power. Of course, 70% of NATO is maintained by the United States. The NATO Supreme Commander is always an American general. The Pentagon is in charge. It has more power. Without the United States, not just the Ukrainian army, but the entire European army couldn't withstand a confrontation with Russia. So what are they going to do? Well, I don't know. I don't know what they'll come up with.
Bueno, pues no lo sé, no sé qué se les ocurrirá. Hombre, uno después de haber escuchado lo de los chis de las lavadoras.
Man, after hearing all the jokes about washing machines, shovels, and donkeys, the tanks pulled out of museums, the cancers Putin supposedly had, the coup the oligarchs were going to stage, and all that nonsense, all that spiel, that whole cathedral of lies they've been using to keep people deceived for 3.5 years, well, they're capable of coming up with anything. In the end, Nebu will be run by Putin. The money there was put by Putin. I don't know. They'll think of something. And if not, who knows, they'll stage a false flag attack somewhere in Europe to justify that Putin is threatening all of Europe. I don't know. They'll come up with something. Because beyond the ridiculousness of the rhetoric, if there's one objective fact, it's that this is a total defeat.
Sí hay un hecho objetivo. Esto es una derrota en toda línea. Eres una derrota de la OTAN.
It's a defeat for NATO that proves its uselessness. And it also shows that this uselessness costs us an enormous amount of money, something that can't be justified. And now in this peace plan, when there are statements from Putin saying that the idea he's threatening Europe is nonsense and that he's willing to put it in writing in the peace treaty, what do these people say? That it's a trick by Putin to deceive us, to make us believe it, and then launch the attacks. Between how bad they are as people, how bad they are as analysts, and the mental delusion they suffer from, which is the most obvious case, there's already an Italian journalist who put it better than anyone, that what Mrs. Callas really needs is to be sent to the doctor.
La señora Callas simplemente lo que hace es mandarla al médico. Esta señora mentalmente está muy mal. Muy mal.
This lady is mentally very unwell. Very unwell. Besides, she's ignorant, illiterate, corrupt, and comes from a family that's been corrupt since the Soviet Union era, right? On top of that, she's mentally very unwell. And those are the hands we're in. Lunatics, thieves, warmongers. Well, that's that. If only this could make European citizens finally realize that those who have lied to them 100 times will lie to them 101, and that no one can trust them. That this political, financial, economic, media, and cultural class must be brought down. That this has to be completely changed.
Que esto hay que cambiarlo por completo. Que Europa tiene que hacer un reset, pero ese sí, entero.
That Europe needs to do a reset, but a full one. If they don't realize that, well, Then tomorrow, or the day after, when they draft, when at NATO's Strategic Communications Center in Riga, by the way, they draft a new narrative to try to keep justifying the unjustifiable. Because of course, if this ends, how will NATO, the European Union, justify a rearmament plan that means the ruin of the welfare state across Europe? How will they justify it? And that's where they are. And it doesn't look good, does it?
This is Juan Antonio. By the way, 3,000 demolishers connected and barely 1,000 likes. Please, demolishers, help us fight censorship with a thumbs up. That's essential for us. This is Juan Antonio. A post from today, just a few hours ago, no more than 2 hours, from the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Pay attention to this text. Putin has the European Union and NATO in his sights. Our intelligence services are issuing urgent warnings. At the very least, Russia is creating the option of declaring war on NATO by 2029. We must deter Russian aggression together with our partners and allies. Well, that's the narrative. They have the war set for 2029, Juan Antonio, according to the official account of it's going to be on February 17th.
At 4 in the afternoon. Because German intelligence, which is almost an oxymoron, meaning a contradiction in terms, already knows it's going to be on February 10th at 4 in the afternoon in 2029. So this guy is either an idiot or he's taken the rest of us for idiots. Let's see, based on what? Intelligence reports? Why doesn't he present them? Some kind of evidence? I don't know. Something. I don't know. I mean, why would he declare war in 2029? Why not in 2028? What's more, if they're weaker now, once a peace agreement is reached in Ukraine, why not launch the divisions against Poland and the Baltics? Why in 2025? Why does he have to wait until 2029? Don't they realize this is the foolishness of a man who's a miserable traitor to Germany, to the German people, who's there, well, who's always worked for whoever he's worked for, and who's there to carry out the designs of an oligarchic class that doesn't care at all about the needs of Germans? I mean, people need to start asking questions. They need to ask questions. Let's see, why 2028? How does this man know? Oh, German intelligence. Well, German intelligence. But they didn't even detect that the NSA had tapped Merkel's and her ministers' phones. What intelligence? They didn't even notice what happened with Nord Stream. What intelligence, really? German foolishness, maybe? Something else? No, look, this is a lie. This is part of the narrative they want you to believe. Because if not, the whole rearmament plan will collapse. And then what will happen? If there's no longer an excuse to take your money and hand it over to the corporations of the military-industrial complex, run by the big financial groups and investment funds, I mean, if that excuse is gone, then what will happen? Then how will they justify the social situation? The cuts, the debt, the inflation, the impoverishment, how will they justify it? If Putin the villain is no longer there, alongside Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, the Ayatollahs, and Maduro, if he's no longer there, how will they justify it? Then the king stands naked. It's quite curious, sometimes things even have a certain charm because of how they happen. It's quite curious that Nabu's operation was called Operation Midas. Just as it's quite curious that the operation carried out against Yermak is called Open Sesame. And why is it called Open Sesame? Open Sesame was the phrase that opened the door to Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves' cave. And do you know what Yermak's nickname is? Ali Baba. I mean, come on, whoever wants to understand will understand. But really, it's so obvious that if you dig just a little deeper, you realize what the current situation is like. So, well, in the coming days, I expect a whole series of statements, each one more scandalous than the last. Why? First, because they need to try to buy time by hiding the reality of what's happening while they build that narrative. Second, because they need to see if somehow they can twist Trump's arm or convince him not to go down that path, since that would mean disaster for the European Union and for NATO. They have to gain that time, and in the meantime, they'll have to say something. So they'll come out saying that Putin is planning an offensive against Europe in 2029. Someone else will say 2028. They'll say anything. And in 2030, in 2035, they'll call for mandatory military service. We're all in danger. Putin is teamed up with the aliens, that sort of thing. Disinformation. Everyone spreading these stories is paid by the Kremlin. They're going to keep us busy with all this nonsense, this madness. What for? To hide what's going on, because deep down, if at some point the American and Russian negotiators reach an agreement on the 28 points, where, of course, Russia still hasn't been officially presented with them, in some areas, Russia will still get more, because that's what a negotiation is. That's a negotiation. And they'll say, no, we'll revise this point, and this point, because I won't accept them as they are. And then, having the upper hand, as Russia does now, both on the battlefield and already on a global level, right? It's quite possible that Trump, as long as what he wants to get, which is the return on investment, and by that I mean the money the United States has put in there and the corresponding profits, isn't affected, will agree. And then, of course, that peace plan will be forced to be signed by the Ukrainian authorities. And by then, Zelensky can no longer be in office. There would be an initial ceasefire, Ukrainian troops would have to withdraw from all of Donbass, elections would be called within 100 days, which would be the negotiation period. And once those 100 days are up, the new president elected would be the one who has to sign. And moreover, he will inevitably be forced to sign, because the one who comes out of those elections, I assure you, since they're elections called by the democratic world, right? I assure you, it will be the one they want.
Juan Antonio, regarding this publication, it's obviously a malicious stupidity. Putin himself rejected it yesterday with vehemence, calling it nonsense, stupidity. Why would they want Europe? And rightly so. What could they possibly want? Territories, natural resources, Russia, precisely. The economy, the growing, formidable, flourishing European economy. Please, what could the Russians want from Europe? But anyway, beyond how false this argument is, aren't we witnessing here a performative act, a performative statement? In communication studies, a performative utterance is a word, a declaration that in itself creates an event, such as, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What is the value of that word? Precisely that the very act of saying it creates something. When these gentlemen are establishing here the supposed Russian intention for a war in 2029, aren't they actually expressing their own intention for a war in 2029?
It's a projection delusion. That is, they know perfectly well that right now it's impossible to confront the Russian army, and they're counting on, well, a rearmament process, militarization in Europe, a return to mandatory military service in order to have troops, because they don't have them at the moment. I mean, when you hear this nonsense, like, no, we're going to deploy 800,000 troops on the eastern borders, 800,000 troops, every 3 months, that adds up to over 2 million troops a year. From where? Come on, where are they going to get them from? Let's see. Tell me, show me the plan. Well, of course, they're expecting two things during that time. First, indeed, to rearm, to prepare logistics. There are even changes in railway lines and roads and so on, bridges, that right now wouldn't withstand the weight of armored vehicles, right? They are thinking indeed about all the rearmament, And by then, elections will have taken place in the United States, and they hope there will be another administration. And then they could indeed face a conflict in the East in which they would once again try, in some way, to provoke a strategic defeat for Russia, which is what they've been seeking, because they have no other way out. They have no other way out. That is to say, the whole of Europe is in a very bad social and economic situation. And so, well, when that has happened at other times in history, there has been a turn toward militarization and toward war as a way out.
That's precisely Tito Rodriguez's question. Tito, thank you very much for your support. Will there be peace after a possible agreement if the Democrats win in the United States? Is that a possible scenario? And I'll link it to Marcos's question here. Thank you very much, Marcos. Do you think it would be in Russia's interest to continue the operation until taking Odessa, and that this might help those in Kiev refuse peace? In other words, considering the possibility of an eventual agreement, but only as a freezing of the conflict, followed by the Democrats' return and the resumption of the war. Then, for Putin, wouldn't it seem more convenient to continue the war until the capture of Odessa?
Let's see. The problem is that if you're presented with a peace plan that's really a capitulation, where you've already achieved the vast majority of your objectives, then it's hard to justify not signing it. It's like if the other side says, "I surrender," and you respond, "No, no, no, it's still not convenient for me." That's hard to justify. If they're already putting on the table most, if not almost all, of the goals you intended to achieve, how are you going to justify it? Indeed, there's a risk that later the West, as usual, because people need to understand this, won't respect the treaties. We can define it this way: the 5+1 nuclear energy treaty with Iran, the treaties on limiting conventional or medium-range weapons, or the Open Skies Treaty with Russia. That is to say, later they don't respect the treaties. What happens is that I think the Russians aren't fools at this point. They were already deceived in Minsk I, deceived in Minsk II, and now they're not going to be easily fooled again. In other words, they're going to demand guarantees. And among other things, those guarantees will go through the United Nations Security Council. That is, the peace treaty must have a legal standing in international law strong enough to later justify any Russian retaliatory action. That is to say, that's how it is. They know that at this point, not honoring the treaty would mean leaving the doors open for Russian forces to continue their advance, not just to Odessa, but to Kiev and as far as they wish. Does that benefit Putin? Well, let's see. A general staff, most likely the Russian general staff, will have anticipated this scenario along with others. They will have planned for it and surely have a plan B. And possibly that plan B involves, at some point, elections where critical and opposition media can once again exist, political parties are legalized, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is not persecuted, and exiled leaders can return or others are released. All of this, along with a certain capacity for development in eastern Ukraine, the richest area, should serve as a mirror for the rest of the Ukrainians. And at the moment when perhaps Ukraine doesn't even join the European Union, because this is an issue that's far from clear, as several countries are directly opposed, then we start with Poland, which no one would have imagined. We start with Poland. Well, possibly Russia's plan B involves, at a certain point, Ukrainian political and social forces themselves demanding a referendum in the regions for their reincorporation into the Russian Federation. And those regions would undoubtedly be Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. This is not going to happen immediately. It wouldn't be immediate.
Esto no va a ser inmediato. No sería inmediato. Es un plan estratégico.
It's a strategic plan. But one of the members of the Duma said recently, and a member of the Ukrainian opposition exiled in Russia also said, that perhaps the future lies in reintegration, or at least in a situation like the union state that Russia has with Belarus. If Ukraine ultimately finds its path blocked, it won't be able to join NATO. And for political and economic reasons within the European Union itself, if it even survives all this, it won't enter the European Union either. Ukraine has only one way out, which is to return to its own world where it came from, the Russian Slavic world, like Belarus. So I think that might be the plan B. This, well, let's be clear, is somewhat speculative, right?
Entiéndase que esto es un poco especulativo, ¿no? Es decir, yo sé que estoy convencido que el plan B existe.
I know that. I'm convinced that plan B exists. I'm saying what I believe could be more marketable at a given moment. Someone says, but, well, the vast majority of the Ukrainian population is already in the Russian zone, or in Russia, or in Europe, and they're not coming back. I have a statistic I received somewhere, and the numbers are truly impressive. That is, possibly in Ukraine right now, in November 2025, there are about 15 or 16 million inhabitants. Out of the 52 million it once had, 15 million already make the country unviable.
15 millones hacen inviable el país ya. De hecho, cuando dicen en el plan de paz que decía...
In fact, when they say in the peace plan, in one of the points, that the Ukrainian army could have up to 600,000 troops, if the country has to be rebuilt, we won't even be able to have 600,000 troops, because you'll need them to rebuild the country. How are you going to form an army of 600,000 troops? What for? To keep confronting Russia, which has already defeated you. Are you going to go back to the same thing? I don't think so. The US administration might change. The Europeans might indeed fail to keep their word as usual, since their promises mean nothing. They might not honor the treaties and might try to rearm. But one thing must also be said. Russia is rearming too, and with China.
Rusia también se arma, ¿eh? Y con China, y con otros. También se arma.
And with others. They're also arming themselves. The ceasefire is also a ceasefire for Russia, a time to strengthen itself. And moreover, Europeans need to understand one thing. If the peace plan is established, and the line of contact is what it is, and there's a demilitarized zone, if that is violated, we would be talking about a clear act of aggression, not against a minority or a pro-Russian sector of the population in a foreign country. No, we'd be talking about Russian territory. Therefore, the Russian military doctrine would come into play, both the pre-nuclear and the nuclear. So, be careful with some of the things the lunatics in Brussels might be thinking in their delusion and psychopathy.
Without abandoning
del todo a Rusia, Juan Antonio.
All right, Juan Antonio, I'd like your opinion on this situation. Here's Delcy Rodriguez, currently Venezuela's Minister of Foreign Affairs, at a binational conference with Russia.
Today, as Venezuela faces serious threats of military aggression, we are grateful for all the expressions of solidarity that Russia continually offers us. Very well, very well.
Bien. ¿Cuál la posibilidad o cuán probable?
What is the likelihood, or how probable is it, that Russia would intervene in defense of Venezuela, either directly or indirectly? How could Russia assist Venezuela? How is it already involved, Juan Antonio? What is the significance of the Russian factor in the current situation between the United States and Venezuela?
La situación actual entre Estados Unidos y Venezuela.
Bueno, o sea, en primer lugar, la información...
Well, first of all, the information is logically quite confidential. This kind of information is highly classified. They're not going to be telling the enemy, the adversary, what kinds of weapon systems they're receiving from Russia or Iran, which we also know have arrived, or from China, which we also know has sent equipment, or from any other South American country that might at some point decide to provide some. But it has been hinted, for example, that anti-aircraft systems, radars, electronic warfare equipment, and Iranian drones have been arriving. Advisors have been arriving because, of course, many of these weapon systems are unfamiliar to the Venezuelans. They need to be taught how to operate them, or even have them operated directly, as NATO officers have done in Ukraine, where some have died in combat zones, obviously because they were either acting as advisors or operating certain weapon systems. So, the assistance exists, it's tangible, but it's also true that just as happened in Ukraine, efforts will be made to prevent a direct clash between American troops and Russian or Chinese troops, or whoever it may be. In other words, that will be the goal. Why? Because the risks of escalation must always be avoided. It's not the same, well, a military operation that you're going to resist with every means at your disposal as an uncontrollable escalation that we all know where it could end up. Well, the only thing I'd say about this issue, because I'm not going to repeat what I said yesterday, is that the U.S. deployment in the Caribbean has already been going on for many weeks. The element of surprise has been lost. With each passing day, the Venezuelan army keeps training, keeps receiving advice, keeps receiving new weapons systems. In other words, the capacity to resist is now greater than it was a month or two ago when all this began. Therefore, I don't see it, I don't believe it, I don't think it will reach that level of stupidity of trying to carry out a ground invasion of a mountainous, jungle-filled country that could easily be overrun with guerrillas. There will be guerrillas who have been in Colombia and will cross over to the Venezuelan side to fight the Americans. They have great experience and know the terrain. The Venezuelan army has been preparing for asymmetric warfare for many years, because theorists of asymmetric warfare have gone there. I even have a manual on asymmetric warfare. So the possibility of offering resistance, not victorious resistance, but of course in asymmetric warfare, victory isn't achieved by defeating the enemy, but by preventing the enemy from defeating you. This is how you win an asymmetric war, by preventing the enemy from defeating you. In that sense, I believe Venezuela can indeed carry out some successful military action. Does the U.S. command know this? They do. They know it perfectly well. So they might try something else, some action to try to decapitate the leaders of the Bolivarian Revolution, like they did in Iran with the 12-day war. Covert operations, mainly to cause economic damage to critical infrastructure. In other words, terrorist actions. Let's not fool ourselves. Let's call it what it is. I do think they can manage to do all that, along with brutal psychological pressure to try to make the Venezuelan regime negotiate its own end. You hear, for example, things that really seem absurd to me too, right? That Maduro might go into a golden exile in Turkey. Is he really going to Turkey, a NATO country? I don't know, those things sound more like psychological warfare than reality, don't they? If things are done properly, by now the Venezuelan High Command should have established a second and third chain of command. That is to say, if there were a surprise military action right now, with missile launches and bombings on sites, bunkers, and other places where Venezuelan leaders and commanders might be, the only thing the Venezuelan command needs to have planned, and there's already experience with this because we've seen it, as I said, in the 12-day war, is a second and third chain of command to immediately replace those who might fall in such an attack. It would be a high-intensity attack at first, but then impossible to sustain over time, because they would also risk, imagine for a moment, that Venezuela had some kind of weapon supplied by Russia or China or whoever, and they took down an American cruiser or destroyer. That, in the United States, would have to be sold to the public. And for Trump, it would be very difficult to sell, not just the fact that some soldiers died, but the impact it would have on public opinion. Which is why we can expect to see some kind of action like that, aside from what we've already been seeing. Those bombings of small boats, and we don't know whether they're carrying fishermen, drug traffickers, or people on vacation. Since there's no proof or evidence of any kind, well, we just have to believe it because Washington says so, right? And that's it. We believe it, don't we? I mean, period. But if there were a larger scale action, which is quite possible, we shouldn't rule it out. I think it would have a limited scope. Maybe to force Venezuelans to negotiate under certain conditions that might interest Trump. I don't see, at least so far, that there are conditions suggesting they could bring down the Bolivarian regime. I mean, I'm afraid not. And then, the impact it will have on public opinion throughout the American countries. I mean, not just Brazil or Nicaragua or Cuba or Colombia, which at some point might show solidarity or even secretly help Venezuela, but also the public opinion in other South American countries, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador. Once again, we're back to Somoza and U.S. interventions as always. What's going on? Are we invading Nicaragua again? And besides, at this point, people are increasingly seeing the drug trafficking excuse as a cheap, clumsy, unbelievable pretext for many reasons. Because anyone who knows even a little about, for example, the issue of heroin plantations in Afghanistan, which reached their peak thanks to NATO's occupation there, and their lowest point now thanks to the Taliban's destruction of those plantations, well, it all sounds very hypocritical. Very much like an excuse. I mean, I think there really is a high risk here if the pressure that's currently building on Venezuela in the Caribbean gets out of hand. A high risk.
Juan Antonio,
Juan Antonio, from Russia's point of view, and even from China's point of view, what are the advantages and disadvantages of greater involvement in Venezuela, of a greater confrontation with the United States in Venezuela? Because indeed, on one hand, there's the risk of a direct clash, without a doubt, but on the other hand, in some way, for example, China might respond to pressure in its own backyard, Taiwan, with pressure in the US backyard. And Russia, in Eastern Europe, would indeed do exactly the same. So obviously, Iran notice, of course, that the actors, that is to say,
what would be convenient, for example, for China, Russia, and others? What would be convenient? Well, that if there were indeed a North American aggression, there would be a certain capacity for resistance so that Venezuela could declare a victory. As I said, in asymmetric warfare, a victory doesn't mean Venezuelan tanks entering Washington, but rather that the hegemonic power doesn't defeat you. If it doesn't defeat you, that's already a victory. So in that case, let's go. Throughout all the towns of the Americas, people will think, this has been thanks, among other things, of course, to the Venezuelan people who are on the front line, but also thanks to other factors, to credible allies like Russia and China. And that would increase, it would be a psychological victory, because it would effectively boost confidence in their countries, and therefore, there would be governments that would see things in a different light, saying, hey, things aren't like they used to be, when they'd send 2 gunboats, and we had to give in. Maybe now they'll be the ones who have to give in. That would be a great victory. And that victory could indeed be expected by the Russians, the Chinese, or whoever, through their support for Venezuela, trying to avoid, as I said, that direct confrontation that would be an escalation. We can't even begin to calculate how far it could go. But at least that, of course, as long as it's beneficial. And with that come other benefits. Arms purchases. Imagine the weapon systems that have proven successful. Arms purchases from those countries, trade agreements, larger infrastructure plans. In other words, trust. Trust at a time when the United States is threatening Mexico, threatening Colombia, threatening Venezuela, threatening Panama, even interfering in elections in Honduras. So at a time like this, well, and on the other hand, without a doubt, it would be a blow to the American-aligned governments that are currently siding with the White House. We're talking about Milei, for example, in Argentina, the most scandalous one. Of course, it would be a blow because it puts them in the spotlight.
Claro que sí, sería un golpe, porque les pone en el ojo del huracán.
By the way, tomorrow we're holding a talk with Nicolás Lantos, one of the most insightful political analysts in Argentina, in my opinion, about Milei in the regional geopolitical context. Here's Trump's post about Honduras. Democracy is at stake in the upcoming elections in the beautiful country of Honduras on November 30th. Not long ago, I remember he described Honduras and the Central American countries as, in English, shitty countries. Literally, countries of shit. Now it's the beautiful country of Honduras. Quite shameless of Mr. Trump. Maduro and his narco-terrorists will take control of another country, as they did with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Who defends democracy and fights against Maduro? That's Tito Asfura, presidential candidate of the National Party. Tito was the successful mayor of Tegucigalpa, where he brought drinking water to millions of people, blah blah blah. His main opponent is Rixi Moncada, who says her idol is Fidel Castro. This is Trump's interventionism with regard to Honduras. In Argentina, he influenced the midterm election with that false promise of an indirect loan through a currency swap that came to nothing. A deal for his buddies, but electorally it caused a shift in the trend. Even Milei's own supporters were predicting a catastrophic defeat, and faced with the fear of an economic crisis as a result of a debt default declaration, well, Milei managed to perform much better than expected. In the upcoming election, the runoff in Chile, he's also taking a very strong stance in favor of candidate Cast against the Communist Party's candidate. For me, a much stronger political intervention, and even an indirectly military one, by China and Russia, would create a rupture both for Latin America, for the Latin American continent, and even for China and Russia in their relationship with the United States. According to Scott Ritter, Russia may have deployed 2 warships in Venezuelan waters. This information is not confirmed. But sometimes the Russians and the Chinese give the impression that they have not yet appeared at that level of confrontation with the United States. Although materially, they are already beginning a direct clash in a multipolar world, they still lack the drive to be present where they should be, in opposition to the United States. Or am I misinterpreting this, Juan Antonio?
No, sí es así. Hombre, lo que pasa es que, como digo, esto...
No, yes, that's how it is. What happens is that, as I said, this is also covert diplomacy. That is, for example, I'm convinced that Chinese and Russian satellites are going to provide intelligence to the Venezuelan army. Absolutely convinced. I don't have the slightest doubt. And if they need to send more electronic warfare systems, more anti-drone systems, more systems, they'll send them. In other words, appearing directly involved creates chaos. And keep in mind that this also affects domestic politics, both in China and Russia, as well as any of the other actors. So they're much more cautious. They don't want to appear as imperialists going in there. They're very careful about that. In China, traditionally, they've never done it. And Russia, because that would mean getting entangled again in situations that, well, I mean, everything has to be said. Later, these things cost Russia, because these are countries that don't have much capacity to respond. That has to be understood. But without a doubt, I think I agree with you that the more presence they gain, the more they can try to counter U.S. policy, which is starting to become very clear.
La política norteamericana que empieza a ser muy clara. Es decir, ellos, yo creo que en Washington saben perfectamente.
That is to say, I believe that in Washington they know perfectly well that a historical process toward multipolarity can no longer be stopped, and therefore they are somehow trying to secure their spheres of influence. And one sphere of influence is all of South America. That's it. And what we're seeing are those kinds of actions aimed at consolidating that sphere of influence. If you manage to confront that process there in South America itself, logically you're doing terrible harm to the North American project and its intentions.
A las intenciones, al proyecto norteamericano. Pero bueno, eso implica
Well, that means it's going to be a conflict zone, something we had already foreseen as well. A very conflictive area in the coming years, just like Africa will be, for similar reasons, because it's a region where what's at stake is who will be the dominant powers that will have a say in Africa. And therefore, we constantly see situations of destabilization, war, terrorism, or coups in Africa. Similar processes may also begin to take place in South America. For the same reason, the United States must secure the American subcontinent just as it must secure Western Europe as its spheres of influence. Otherwise, its power within a multipolar world will accelerate its decline. That's how it is. Of course, what happens? Well, as in the European case, this is in the hands of American citizens, who must be able to see things clearly and decide freely, right? To know what they want for the future. You know, some people, yes, I know what they like is to leave. They'd like to be just another North American. Well, hey, let them go there, right? But I mean, it's up to the South Americans to say, no, we want to be ourselves. Of course, with the division that has existed among the states, a historical issue we won't get into now, that has existed throughout South America, each country on its own, facing the great North American hegemonic power, can do very little. It's very weak. So then, while the only thing that can be done is to apply a fundamental geopolitical imperative, which is to increase, if your relative power is small, your relative power, how? Adding to the relative power of the other states. That is moving toward convergence, a South American, Pan-American, Latin American union that would make it possible to face a hegemonic power like the one in the North, right? If all the resources of all the countries in the Americas were coordinated, concentrated, and converging in a specific direction, yes, the United States would still be very powerful in trying to impose itself, but the power gap would no longer be insurmountable. What would they do? Invade all the continents? They can't.
The cost is much higher, truly.
I couldn't. If Afghanistan cost what it did in trillions of dollars, and it was just a country of mountains and goat herders, imagine what it would be like to try to dominate the entire subcontinent. It's impossible.
The elections in Honduras are just 2 days away. Just as a side note, here are the campaign slogans. Pay attention to this, Juan Antonio. On one side, Asfora, mentioned by Trump. Papi at your service is his campaign slogan. Papi at your service, Trump's candidate. The candidate dismissed by Trump in his speech, Rixi Moncada, has the slogan, Public good and sovereignty unite us. Let the people keep governing. They shall not return. And then there's another candidate also close to Trump, Mario Rivera, from the Christian Democratic Party, with the slogan, Let's join the gringos for a different kind of change. A confession in itself, evidence enough.
This is like in Argentina, the whole Braden or Perón thing, right? It's the same, isn't it? I mean, the American ambassador or Perón. What I really have a hard time understanding is how someone can vote for a candidate who says, Daddy at your service. I mean, come on. It can't be. It just can't be. I can't wrap my head around it. Hey, if you want to be a slave, fine. Go to the United States, ask for some chains, And with the chains and an iron ball, start serving hamburgers there. Then you're a slave. Don't mess things up for everyone else.
No fastidies a los demás.
No, y ahora te machacan a palazos también, ¿eh? Además.
And now they beat you with clubs too, because right away ICE arrests you, deports you, and mistreats you along the way. They don't even want the sellouts. Of course, not all Latin American migrants in the United States are sellouts, but those sellouts with phrases like "papi at your service" or "let's join the gringos," those are the real sellouts. Those ones, welcome to the United States. The door is wide open. Whoever wants to go, go ahead.
They set up a soccer team with Guaido and put you on it.
Juan Antonio, como siempre, un placer la conversación.
Juan Antonio, as always, it's a pleasure talking with you. Sorry for bringing up the topic of Venezuela, which we hadn't mentioned before. But I know you can always respond to any geopolitical issue with great ease. That's why I asked. In just a bit, in 20 minutes, Fernando Moragon will start discussing Ukraine on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics. And tomorrow, Juan Antonio, you'll also be on MP Geopolitics. Will you be available on Saturday?
Yes, yes, yes. If there are no storms, the weather doesn't get in the way or anything like that, as I said before in Los Toros, yes, yes, perfect.
Demolishers,
thank you very much for joining us. Until next time, Juan Antonio. Bye-bye, see you soon, and greetings to everyone.
¿Qué?